Okay, so, um, chapter 17. Okay, so today I have a cup of tea. I have a cup of Earl Grey tea with some sugar in it. But yeah. So I think I'm only reading 8 pages because 263. It's not that long of a chapter. So I'm reading 263 to 270, and also I'm gonna publicize all these videos and probably rename them and put them in a playlist sometime. Maybe like after I upload this. I'm not sure. Whenever I get around to it, I'm pretty busy this week. I have so much. Okay. So chapter 17, 263. Manifest Destiny and its legacy. Territorial expansion dominated American diplomacy and politics in the 1840s. Settlers swarming into the still disputed Oregon country aggravated relations with Britain, which had staked its own claims in the Pacific Northwest. The clamor to annex Texas to the Union provoked bitter tension with Mexico, which continued to regard Texas as a Mexican province in revolt. And when Americans began casting covetous eyes on Mexico's northernmost province, the great prize of California, open warfare erupted between the United States and its southern neighbor. Victory over Mexico added vast new domains to the United States, but it also raised thorny questions about the status of slavery and the newly acquired territories, questions that would be answered in blood in the Civil War of the 1860s. The accession of Tyler, II. A horde of hard Siderites descended upon Washington in early 1841, clamoring for the spoils of office. Newly elected President Harrison, bewildered by the uproar, was almost hounded to death by Whig spoilsmen. The real leaders of the Whig Party regarded old Tippecanoe as a little more than an impressive figurehead. Daniel Webster, as Secretary of State, and Henry Clay, the uncrowned king of the Whigs and their ablest spokesman in the Senate, would grasp the helm. The aging general was finally forced to rebuke the overzealous Clay and pointedly remind him that he, William Henry Harrison, was the President of the United States. Unluckily for Clay and Webster, their scheme soon hit a fatal snag. Before the new term had fairly started, Harrison contracted pneumonia. Wearied by official functions and plagued by office seekers, the enfeebled old warrior died after only 4 weeks in the White House, by far the shortest administration in American history, following by far the longest inaugural address. The Tyler II part of the Whig ticket, hitherto only a rhyme, now claimed the spotlight. What manner of man did the nation now find in the presidential chair? 6 feet tall, slender, blue-eyed, and fair-haired, with classical features and a high forehead, John Tyler was a Virginia gentleman of the old school, gracious and kindly, yet stubbornly attached to the principle. He had earlier resigned from the Senate, quite unnecessarily, rather than accept distasteful instructions from the Virginia legislature. Still a lone wolf, he had forsaken the Jacksonian Democratic fold for that of the Whigs, largely because he could not stomach the dictatorial tactics of Jackson. Tyler's enemies accused him of being a Democrat in Whig clothing, but this charge was only partially true. The Whig Party, like the Democratic Party, was something of a catch-all, and the accidental president belonged to the minority wing, which embraced a number of Jeffersonian states' riders. Tyler had in fact been put on the ticket partly to attract the vote of this fringe group, many of whom were influential Southern gentry. Yet Tyler, high-minded as he was, should never have consented to run on the ticket. Although the dominant Clay-Webster group had published no platform, every alert politician knew that the unpublished platform what the unpublished platform contained. And on virtually every major issue, the obstinate Virginian was at odds with a majority of his adoptive Whig Party, which was pro-bank, pro-protective tariff, and pro-internal improvements. Tyler, too, rhymed with Tippecanoe, but there was harmony ended. As events turned out, President Harrison, the Whig, served for only 4 weeks, whereas Tyler, the ex-Democrat, who was still largely a Democrat at heart, served for 204 weeks. John Tyler, a president without a party. After their hard-won, hard-cider victory, the Whigs brought their not-so-secret platform out of Clay's waistcoat pocket. To the surprise of no one, it outlined a strongly nationalistic program. Financial reform came first. The Whig Congress hastened to pass a law ending the independent treasury system, and President Tyler, disarmingly agreeable, signed it. Clay next drove through the Congress a bill for the fiscal bank, which would establish a new bank of the United States. Tyler's hostility to its centralized bank was notorious, and Clay, the great compromiser, would have done well to conciliate him, but the Kentuckian, robbed repeatedly of the presidency by lesser men, was in imperious mood and riding for a fall. When the bank bill reached the presidential desk, Tyler flatly vetoed it, and on both practical and constitutional grounds. A drunken mob gathered late at night near the White House and shouted insultingly, "Huzzah for Clay! A bank! A bank! Down with the veto!" The stunned Whig leaders tried once again. Striving to pacify Tyler's objections to a fiscal bank, they passed another bill providing for a fiscal corporation. But the president, still unbending, vetoed the offensive substitute. The Democrats were jubilant. They had been saved from another financial monster only by the pneumonia that had felled Harrison. Whig extremists, seething with indignation, condemned Tyler as his accidency and as an executive ass. Widely burned in effigy, he received numerous letters threatening him with death. A wave of influenza then sweeping the country was called the Tyler Grip. To the delight of the Democrats, the stiff-necked Virginian was formally expelled from his party by a caucus of Whig congressmen, and a serious attempt to impeach him was broached in the House of Representatives. His entire cabinet resigned in a body, except Secretary of State Webster, who was then in the midst of delicate negotiations with England. The proposed Whig tariff also felt the prick of the president's well-inked pen. Tyler appreciated the necessity of bringing additional revenue to the Treasury, but old Democrat that he was, he looked with a frosty eye on the major tariff scheme of the Whigs because it provided, among other features, for a distribution among the states of revenue from the sale of the public lands in the West. Tyler could see no point in squandering federal money when the federal treasury was not overflowing, and he again wielded an emphatic veto. Chess and Clayites drafted their tariff bill. They chopped out the offensive dollar distribution scheme and pushed down the rates to about the moderately protective level of 1832, roughly 32% on dutiable goods. Tyler had no fondness for the protective tariff, but realizing the need for additional revenue, he reluctantly signed the tariff of 1842. In subsequent months, the pressure for higher customs duties slackened as the country gradually edged its way out of the Depression. The Whig slogan, Harrison, $2 a day and roast beef, was reduced by unhappy Democrats to 10 cents a day and bean soup. Excuse me. A war of words with Britain. Hatred of Britain during the 19th century came to a head periodically and had to be lanced by treaty settlement or by war. The poison had festered ominously by 1842. Anti-British passions were composed of many ingredients. At bottom lay the bitter red-coated memories of two Anglo-American wars. In addition, the genteel pro-British Federalists had died out, eventually yielding to the boisterous Jacksonian Democrats. British travelers, sniffing with aristocratic noses at the crude scene, wrote acidly of American tobacco spitting, slave auctioneering, lynching, eye-gouging, and other unsavory features of the rustic republic. Travel books penned by these critics, whose views were avidly read on both sides of the Atlantic, stirred up angry outbursts in America. But the literary fireworks did not end there. British magazines added fuel to the flames when enlarging on the travel books, they launched sneering attacks on Yankee shortcomings. American journals struck back with the "you're another" arguments, thus touching off the Third War with England. Fortunately, this British-American war was fought with paper broadsides and only ink was spilled. British authors, including Charles Dickens, entered the fray with gall-dipped pens, for they were being denied rich royalties by the absence of an American copyright law. Sprawling America, with expensive canals to dig and railroads to build, was a borrowing nation in the 19th century. Imperial Britain, with its overflowing coffers, was a lending nation. The well-heeled creditor is never popular with the down-at-the-heels debtor, and the phrase bloated British bondholder rolled bitterly from many an American tongue. When the Panic of 1837 broke and several states defaulted on their bonds or repudiated them openly, honest Englishmen assailed Yankee trickery. One of them offered a new stanza for an old song. Yankee Doodle borrows cash, Yankee Doodle spends it, and then he snaps his fingers at the jolly flat who lends it. That's really cute. Troubles of a more dangerous sort came closer to home in 1837 when a short-lived insurrection erupted in Canada. It was supported by such a small minority of Canadians that it never had a real chance of success, yet hundreds of hot-blooded Americans, hoping to strike a blow for freedom against the hereditary enemy, furnished military supplies or volunteered for armed service. The Washington regime tried arduously, though futilely, to uphold its weak neutrality regulations, but again, as in the case of Texas, it simply could not enforce unpopular laws in the face of popular opposition. A provocative incident on the Canadian frontier brought passions to a boil in 1837. An American steamer, the Caroline, was carrying supplies to the insurgents across the swift Niagara River. It was finally attacked on the New York shore by a determined British force, which set the vessel on fire. Lurid American illustrators showed the flaming strip, laden with shrieking souls, plummeting over the Niagara Falls, with the craft, in fact, sank short of the plunge, and only one American was killed. This unlawful invasion of American soil, a counter-violation of neutrality, had alarming aftermaths. Washington officials lodged vigorous but ineffective protests. 3 years later, in 1840, the incident was dramatically revived in the state of New York. A Canadian named MacLeod, after allegedly boasting in a tavern of his part in the Caroline raid, was arrested and indicated for murder. The London Foreign Office, which regarded the Caroline raiders as members of a sanctioned armed force and not as criminals, made clear that his execution would mean war. Fortunately, MacLeod was freed after establishing an alibi. It must have been all right, for it was good enough to convince a New York jury. The tension forthwith eased, but it snapped taut again in 1841 when British officials in the Bahamas offered asylum to 130 Virginia slaves who had rebelled and captured the American ship Creole. Britain had abolished slavery within its empire in 1833, raising Southern fears that its Caribbean possessions would become Canada-like havens for escaped slaves. Manipulating the Maine maps. An explosive controversy of the early 1840s involved the Maine boundary dispute. The St. Lawrence River is icebound several months of the year, as the British, remembering the War of 1812, well knew. They were determined, as a defensive precaution against the Yankees, to build a road westward from the seaport of Halifax to Quebec, but the proposed route ran through disputed territory, claimed also by Maine under the misleading peace treaty of 1783. Tough-knuckled lumberjacks from both Maine and Canada entered the disputed no-man's land of the tall-timbered Aroostook River Valley. Ugly fights flared up, and both sides summoned the local militia. The small-scale lumberjack clash, which was dubbed the Aroostook War, threatened to widen into a full-dress shooting war. As the crisis deepened in 1842, the London Foreign Office took an unusual step. It sent to Washington a non-professional diplomat, the conciliatory financier Lord Ashburton, who had married a wealthy American woman. He speedily established cordial relations with his secretary Webster, who had recently been lionized during a visit to Britain. The two statesmen, their nerves frayed by protracted negotiations in the heat of a Washington summer, finally agreed to compromise on the Maine boundary. On the basis of a rough split-the-difference arrangement, the Americans were to retain some 7,000 square miles of the 12,000 square miles of wilderness in dispute. The British got less land, but won the desired Halifax-Quebec route. During the negotiations, the Caroline affair, after malingering since 1837, was patched up by an exchange of diplomatic notes. An overlooked bonus sneaked in by small print of the same treaty. The British, in adjusting the U.S.-Canadian boundary farther west, surrendered 6,500 square miles. The area was later found to contain the priceless Mesabi iron ore of Minnesota. Just one second. Sorry. I had to turn my light on because the sun went away. Okay. The Lone Star of Texas shines alone. During the uncertain 8 years since 1836, Texas had led a precarious existence. Mexico, refusing to recognize Texas's independence, regarded the Lone Star Republic as a province in revolt, to be reconquered in the future. Mexican officials loudly threatened war if the American Eagle should ever gather the fledgling republic under its protective wings. The Texans were forced to maintain a costly military establishment. Vastly outnumbered by their Mexican foe, they could not tell when he would strike again. Mexico actually did make 2 half-hearted raids that, though ineffectual, foreshadowed more fearsome efforts. Confronted with such perils, Texas was driven to open negotiations with Britain and France, in the hope of securing the defensive shield of a protectorate. In 1839 and 1840, the Texans concluded treaties with France, Holland, and Belgium. Britain was intensely interested in an independent Texas. Such a republic would check the southward surge of the American colossus, whose bulging biceps posed a constant threat to nearby British possessions in the New World. A puppet Texas, dancing to strings pulled by Britain, could be turned upon the Yankees. Subsequent clashes would create a smoke-screen diversion behind which the foreign powers could move into the Americas and challenge the insolent Monroe Doctrine. French schemers were likewise attracted by the hoary game of divide and conquer. These actions would result, they hoped, in the fragmentation and militarization of America. Dangers threatened from other foreign quarters. British abolitionists were busily intriguing for a foothold in Texas. If successful in freeing the few blacks there, they presumably would inflame the nearby slaves of the South. In addition, British merchants regarded Texas as a potentially important free trade area, an offset to the tariff-walled United States. British manufacturers likewise perceived that those vast Texas plains constituted one of the great cotton-producing areas of the future. An independent Texas would relieve British looms of their chronic dependence on American fiber, a supply that might be cut off in time of crisis by embargo or war. The belated Texas nuptials, partly because of the fears aroused by British schemers, Texas became a leading issue in the presidential campaign of 1844. The foes of expansion assailed annexation, while Southern hotheads cried Texas or disunion. The pro-expansion Democrats under James K. Polk finally triumphed over the Whigs under Henry Clay, the hardy perennial candidate. Lame duck President Tyler thereupon interpreted the narrow Democratic victory with dubious accuracy as a mandate to acquire Texas. Eager to crown his troubled administration with this splendid prize, Tyler deserves much of the credit for shepherding Texas into the fold. Many anti-slavery Whigs feared that Texas and the Union would be red meat to nourish the lusty slave power. Aware of their opposition, Tyler despaired of securing the needed two-thirds vote for a treaty in the Senate. He therefore arranged for annexation by a joint resolution. This solution required only a simple majority in both houses of Congress. After a spirited debate, the resolution passed early in 1845, and Texas was formally invited to become the 20th star in the American flag. Mexico angrily charged that the Americans had despoiled it of Texas. There was truth to this claim, especially in 1836, when the Texans first seceded, but considerably less so in 1845, when the area was no longer Mexico's to be despoiled of. By then, the situation had become even more complex. More than a decade of widespread Comanche raids had further demonstrated the weakness of Mexican influence in the region. As the years stretched out, realistic observers could see that Mexico would not be able to reconquer its lost province. The most astute observers could further see that victory in war against Mexico would not resolve all tensions. A powerful and integrated network of Comanche tribes still had to be reckoned with. By 1845, the Lone Star Republic had become a danger spot, inviting foreign intrigue that menaced the American people. The continued existence of Texas as an independent nation threatened to involve the United States in a series of ruinous wars, both in America and in Europe. Americans were in a lick-all-creation mood when they sang Uncle Sam's song to Miss Texas. If Mexi, backed by secret foes, still talks of getting you, gal, we can lick 'em all you know and then annex 'em too, gal. Okay. What other powers would have spurned the imperial domain of Texas? The bride was so near, so rich, so fair, so willing. Whatever the peculiar circumstances of the Texas Revolution, the United States can hardly be accused of unseemly haste in achieving annexation. 9 long years were surely a decent wait between the beginning of courtship and the consummation of the marriage. Oregon fever populates Oregon. The so-called Oregon country was an enormous wilderness. It sprawled magnificently west of the Rockies to the Pacific Ocean and north of Carolina to the line of 5440, the present southern tip of the Alaska Panhandle. All or substantial parts of this immense area were claimed at one time or another by 4 nations: Spain, Russia, Britain, and the United States. 2 claimants dropped out of the scramble. Spain, though first to raise its banner in Oregon, bartered away its claims to the United States in the so-called Florida Treaty of 1819. Russia retreated to the line of 5440 by the treaties of 1824 and 1825. With America and Britain, these 2 remaining rivals now had the field to themselves. British claims to Oregon were strong, at least to that portion north of the Columbia River. They were based squarely on the prior discovery and exploration, on treaty rights, and on actual occupation. The most important colonizing agency was the far-flung Hudson's Bay Company, which was trading profitably with the Indians of the Pacific Northwest for furs. Americans, for their part, could also point pridefully to exploration and occupation. Captain Robert Gray in 1792 had stumbled upon the majestic Columbia River, which he named after his ship, and the famed Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806 had ranged overland through the Oregon country to the Pacific. This shaky American toehold was ultimately strengthened by the presence of missionaries and other settlers, a sprinkling of whom reached the grassy Willamette River Valley, south of the Columbia, in the 1830s. These men and women of God, in saving the soul of the Indian, were instrumental in saving the soil of Oregon for the United States. They stimulated interest in a faraway domain that countless Americans had earlier assumed would not be settled for centuries. Scattered American and British pioneers in Oregon continued to live peacefully side by side. At the time of negotiating the Anglo-American Convention of 1818, the United States had sought to divide the vast domain at the 49th parallel. But the British, who regarded the Columbia River as the St. Lawrence of the West, were unwilling to yield this vital artery. A scheme for peaceful joint occupation was thereupon adopted, pending future settlement. The handful of Americans in the Willamette Valley was suddenly multiplied in the early 1840s when Oregon fever seized hundreds of restless pioneers. In increasing numbers, their creek-covered wagons jolted over the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail as the human rivulet widened into a stream. By 1846, about 5,000 Americans had settled south of the Columbia River, some of them tough border ruffians, expert with bowie knife and revolving pistol. The British, in the face of this rising torrent of humanity, could muster only 700 or so subjects north of the Columbia. Losing out lopsidedly in the population race, they were beginning to see the wisdom of arriving at a peaceful settlement before being engulfed by their neighbors. A curious fact is that only a relatively small segment of the Oregon country was in actual controversy by 1845. The area in dispute consisted of the rough quadrangle between the Columbia River on the south and east, the 49th parallel on the north, and the Pacific Ocean on the west. Britain had repeatedly offered the line of Columbia, America had repeatedly offered the 49th parallel. The whole fateful issue was now tossed into the presidential election of 1844, where it was largely overshadowed by the question of annexing Texas. A mandate for Manifest Destiny. Two major parties nominated their presidential standard-bearers. In May 1844, ambitious but often frustrated Henry Clay, easily the most popular man in the country, was enthusiastically chosen by the Whigs at Baltimore. The Democrats, meeting there later seemed hopelessly deadlocked. Van Buren's opposition to annexing Texas ensured his defeat, given domination of the party by Southern expansionists. Finally, party delegates trotted out and nominated James K. Polk of Tennessee, America's first dark horse or surprise presidential candidate. Polk may have been a dark horse, but he was hardly an unknown or decrepit nag. Speaker of the House of Representatives for 4 years and Governor of Tennessee for 2 terms, he was a determined, industrious, ruthless, and intelligent public servant. Sponsored by Andrew Jackson, his friend and neighbor, he was rather implausibly touted by Democrats as yet another young Hickory. Whigs attempted to jeer him into oblivion with the taunt, "Who's James K. Polk?" They soon found out. The campaign of 1844 was in part an expression of the mighty emotional upsurge known as Manifest Destiny. Countless citizens in the 1840s and 50s, feeling a sense of mission, believed that Almighty God had manifestly destined the American people for a hemispheric career. They would irresistibly spread their uplifting and ennobling democratic institutions over at least the entire continent, and possibly over South America as well. Land, greed, and ideals, empire and liberty, were thus conveniently conjoined. Expansionist Democrats, strongly swayed by the intoxicating spell of Manifest Destiny. They came out flat-footedly in their platform for the reannexation of Texas and the reoccupation of Oregon, all the way to 5440. Outbellowing the Whig log cabinites in the game of slogans, they shouted all Oregon or none. The slogan 5440 or fight was not coined until 2 years later in 1846. They also condemned Clay as a corrupt bargainer, a dissolute character, and a slave owner. Their own candidate, Polk, also owned slaves, a classic case of the pot calling the kettle black. The Whigs, as noisemakers, took no backseat. They countered with such slogans as "Hooray for Clay" and "Polk Slavery in Texas" or "Clay Union and Liberty." They also spread the lie that a gang of Tennessee slaves had been seen on their way to a southern market branded with the initials JKP, James K. Polk. On the crucial issue of Texas, the acrobatic Clay tried to ride 2 horses at once. The great compromiser appears to have compromised away the presidency when he wrote a series of confusing letters. They seem to say that while he personally favored annexing slaveholding Texas, an appeal to the South, he also favored postponement, an appeal to the North. He might have lost more ground if he had not straddled, but he certainly alienated the more ardent anti-slavery rights. In the stretch drive, dark horse Polk nipped Henry Clay at the wire. 170 to 105 votes in the Electoral College, and 1,338,464 to 1,300,097 in the popular column. Clay would have won if he had not lost New York State by a scant 5,000 votes. The tiny anti-slavery Liberty Party absorbed nearly 16,000 votes, many of which would otherwise have gone to the unlucky Kentuckian. Ironically, the anti-Texas Liberty Party, by spoiling Clay's chances and helping to ensure the election of pro-Texas Polk, hastened the annexation of Texas. Land-hungry Democrats, flushed with victory, proclaimed that they had received a mandate from the voters to take Texas, but a presidential election is seldom, if ever, a clear-cut mandate on anything. The only way to secure a true reflection of the voters' will is to hold a special election on a given issue. The picture that emerged in 1844 was not one of mandate, but of muddle. What else could there have been when the results were so close, the personalities so colorful, and the issues so numerous, including Oregon, Texas, the tariff, slavery, the bank, and internal improvements? Yet this unclear mandate was interpreted by President Tyler as a crystal clear charge to annex Texas, and he signed the joint resolution 3 days before leaving the White House. Okay. I read a little poorly, so that took a bit longer, but